Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution we know we need. Welcome to Blueprints, Gio. Thank you for joining us.
Super glad to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, Jessa.
I appreciate your time. It must be a busy one. We're here to talk about Venezuela. But before that, can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. My name is Gio Maher. I'm an abolitionist educator located in Philadelphia. I coordinate the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction, aka Abolition School. Look us up. It may seem strange to folks that we're here to talk about Venezuela, but we understand abolition to be a global struggle. We understand abolition to necessarily be an internationalist struggle. And for me, my background is in simultaneously struggling against police violence and the carceral structure in the U.S. while going back and forth to Venezuela to see and realize that the Venezuelans have historically been struggling for many of the same things: community power, community control, community safety, without the sort of carceral, apparatus, and without global sort of state and imperial militaristic violence. So for me, these are very much the same struggle.
You've talked before about the need to build or rebuild systems, communities, structures at the same time as we work to smash down systems, right? To not leave a void. Some of the examples that we're hopefully going to talk about today of what's going on in Venezuela, I mean, not the U.S. and state actions, but the grassroots actions and what came from those actions that might help people resist what's happening now, to abolish U.S. imperialism.
No, certainly. This is, again, I think it's really important to start with some very broad understanding of broad framings. What capitalism has done historically as it spreads across the globe, and we often refer to this as primitive accumulation, is to destroy community, right? Capital cannot extract resources, labor, and wealth without first destroying communal structures. So that, again, that happened globally. It happened in Europe, and then it spread across the globe, and it happened to indigenous communities. It's still going on, right? Many of those communities in the global south in particular still persist and struggle. But part of what our task is, and again, this is where Venezuela and abolition come together in a very clear way, is to rebuild community, right? When we're talking about, for example, in Philadelphia, building communities without police, what we're talking about is rebuilding community structures. And when Venezuelans are struggling for safety and security and for, sort of self-managed socialism in the communes, they're struggling for very much the same thing, right? What does it mean to rebuild community and begin from the question of what it is that communities need instead of what it is that the global market needs in terms of oil, to fuel its sort of expansive, and voracious capitalism.
One of your other books, I was looking through your catalog, obviously, and I'm going, we could have an episode on each one of these. It was really hard for me to focus. Obviously, you've written 2 on Venezuela, but you have another one, Anti-Colonial Eruptions, and the idea that colonialism, imperialism requires like a dehumanization as well. And a light bulb just went off as you were speaking. And I was looking through the timeline of what's happened in Venezuela, particularly in the last year, of the way the U.S. first positioned Venezuelans living within the U.S. as criminals and deporting them, and helped frame them as less than, and as the enemy within. And I think some of that helped set the stage. I mean, that's not really what we were here to talk about. It was just kind of all the kind of bits that you've gathered throughout your writings has, I think, going to make for an interesting conversation here on what might be going on within the grassroots movements right now in Venezuela.
Yeah. The fundamental argument of that book, I think it's, I'm glad you brought it up. The fundamental argument of that is that sort of racial and colonial power relies on dehumanization, of course. That's the structure of it, right? It requires the insistence that these people don't matter, they're invisible, they're outside of the frame of reality. And that helps to justify colonialism and the absolute brutal exploitation and even genocide, of course, of peoples, which is the ultimate telos of colonial power. But part of what that book tries to argue is that it also creates a vast blind spot that is a weakness for colonial rule, right? It creates a hubris, in other words, this sort of radical arrogance, whereby colonial power misjudges its own capacities and underestimates the poor, underestimates the colonized, right? And we see this everywhere. We see it on October 7th with the sort of surprise, resistance attacks that were that the IDF should have expected but couldn't expect, right? But also the first place that I saw this and understood this was actually in Venezuela, right? The Bolivarian process begins with a mass rebellion in 1989 against neoliberal structural adjustment. And elites in Venezuela were absolutely shocked by this rebellion. They were shocked that people rose up. They were shocked that people threw the political system into chaos. It's this chaos that then creates the possibility of a revolutionary process. But the fact that they were shocked speaks to the fact that they themselves had been blinded by their own hubris, by their own power. And I think we should always be looking for that, always understanding the way that systems of power are underestimating those they're up against. So when you look at this sort of strike on Venezuela, this apparently very effective and very clean military operation, we need to think about what kind of arrogance and hubris is built into that and what it makes possible, right? We see it very clearly in the fact that the U.S. government feels as if Venezuelans will be celebrating in the streets, and that is a fundamental misjudgment of the reality on the ground. It's a misjudgment of the solid ideological foundations of the Bolivarian project, even though that's a project that's been in crisis, economic and political crisis for some time. But the Venezuelan people are more ideologically developed, more conscious, more organized than many other people on the planet, right? And so to underestimate their capacity to resist is, a potentially fatal mistake for the U.S.
We're going to dive right into that because I think it's the one hopeful thing, not that we can just rest on hope. We'll have follow-up guests on to talk about the organizing that's happening within Canada, within the United States, like against the imperialists. But you also, I think it brings you to one of your books, We Created Chavez, where it's not just a blind spot for our enemies. We tend to feed into it sometimes when we look back at the Chavez era. It's figure-based, state-based, right? It was, and even called Chavistas. So we attribute a lot to political personalities. In the same way, folks are attributing a lot of this strictly to Trump. We'll challenge that as well. But let's talk about what you discovered in terms of that era and the foundations that were created in, tough economic times, in political crisis, that helped lay the groundwork for that kind of resistance that you're talking about, that we're hoping they'll face.
It's, the fundamental argument of We Created Chavez was, as the sort of title suggests, right, that this was not the work of a single individual. Revolution is never the work of a single individual. Individuals can't make revolutions, right? Individuals can intervene in specific historical moments of opportunity to play incredibly important roles, and that's exactly what Chavez did, right? He intervened in a moment of the crisis of the old system, and he helped to propel forward this sort of project. But the Bolivarian project, the Bolivarian Revolution, was one that predated him. Bolivarianism emerges, and this is what I show when We Created Chavez, out of the Venezuelan armed struggle of the 1960s and 70s, and out of the sort of strategic debates and conversations and attempts to build different kinds of movements, and the failures and the sort of building on those failures, right? Moving from the guerrilla struggle to the development of mass-based political front organizing in poor neighborhoods around Caracas, mass-based sort of revolutionary organizing demands around territory and space, the emergence of grassroots assemblies in the aftermath of the Caracazo, that mass rebellion in 1989. All of that is happening, right? And it's in that moment and in direct response to the 1989 rebellions that Chavez attempts a coup in 1992, right? Again, he's not some individual military, and this is something that I think people misunderstand on a fundamental level, because we're told this is a military strongman, individual caudillo. Chavez comes from the military, but he also came from a very specific kind of military background, which was a progressive military background. There's an entire sort of history of this in Venezuela. And on top of that, he was in direct contact with the armed revolutionary underground. His brother was a member of the armed revolutionary underground. The former guerrilla leaders that had sort of been active in the 70s and 80s were working with him to build a framework for what ultimately becomes the communal project, right? That was already developed in the 1990s. The idea that the goal was to dismantle this brutal and sort of bloated oil state and to replace it with a federated structure of councils across Venezuelan society, right? A radically democratic alternative, to build socialism. All of that had already developed, right? Chavez came to play an important role in that. And I'll be clear, an incredibly important role, right? Grassroots movements had no better ally than Hugo Chavez. He was able to leverage and move a political movement and also elements of the state structure in ways that Nicolas Maduro, for example, has not been able to, right? Just simply out of capacity, right? And so Chavez was the kind of person who would be able to sort of himself empower and try to, support these grassroots struggles. His last will and testament, meaning this speech he gave in 2012 called the Golpe de Timon, was fully dedicated to sort of locking in his legacy as the communal project, right? And the communal, what he calls the sort of communal state. Again, this idea of overcoming and surpassing the traditional bourgeois state structure with a collective and radically democratic project. That is what Chavismo stood for. And again, it's kind of frustrating to have to repeat over and over again the fact that this is not about individuals today, right? And when I wrote We Created Chavez, it was confronting the reality that people on the right, people on the left, sort of anarchists, socialists, fascists, like everyone saw this as an individual phenomenon, right? They hated Chavez or they loved Chavez. Today, we're seeing something very similar, which is the idea that, first and foremost, the idea that simply taking out Maduro and Celia Flores means the revolution is over, which is nonsense. But also simultaneously, this idea that that the process itself could only occur and only operate through these kinds of kind of individuals. And we need to resist that. We need to understand that the process is not even the leadership of Delcy Rodriguez and Diosdado Cabello and those in power now. The force of the Bolivarian Revolution has always been the revolutionary grassroots organizations.
I can't imagine like a better defense against imperialist aggression than the type of federated network that folks are aspiring to build and have built to some degree. You call them like experiments in democracy, and I've seen stabs at it in Canada. Nothing significant. Can you describe some of these examples, the communes that you talk about? Just generally, I think it's hard for people to imagine. I think when you say commune, if folks have done their history, maybe they know about the Paris Commune. Otherwise, it's a bit of a phenomenon. And I think facing Trump's aggression, and there's rhetoric here in Canada for you to know that, we also have a lot of oil, and he's not been terribly, shy about how he feels about annexing us. So there's discussion always in the best way to defend against something like that. And unfortunately, it often goes to arming the state to the teeth, arming our neoliberal states with all of the tax dollars we could scrape together. And so let's kind of demonstrate what an alternative way we can spend our energy and our resources to actually fend off not just U.S. aggression, but the damages and impacts of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And again, this, on the one hand, emerged and began to emerge organically in Venezuela in the course of the struggles against neoliberal power in the 70s and 80s, in the struggles for community self-defense. So you had popular militias forming in the 70s and 80s that threw the police out of poor neighborhoods and took control of security themselves, right? But at the same time, I don't want to act as if these are not influenced by broader ideological tendencies, because these people were communists, right? They had come out of the armed struggle, or were influenced by Che Guevara, or were influenced by other sort of like segments of the left, and that is the vision that they brought to these kind of strategic questions. So this is emerging in the 70s and the 80s. Again, I mentioned the popular barrio assemblies that emerged after 1989. And it's always important to understand in the context of Venezuela that there is a pattern where things emerge from the grassroots and then are picked up by the government and picked up by the state and formalized, right? And there's always something that's lost in the process of that formalization, but it's also a very powerful process to expand, the scope of collective power. So Venezuela, when it rewrites its constitution in 1999, centers and supports popular participatory power, although it doesn't specify exactly what that looks like. That then provides leverage for the government in beginning, particularly around 2006, to make a more radical turn, right? The first few years of the Bolivarian process are social welfare, right? Free education, free healthcare, redirecting oil wealth to make up for what's often referred to as the historical debt of neoliberalism, and the extreme poverty that it had created. The more radical turn is a question of reshaping political power. Around 2006, this takes the form of what are referred to as communal councils. They emerge across the country. There are 30,000 communal councils developed very quickly. And these were spaces in which small communities, local communities, would come together, debate and discuss what they needed, and then appeal to the government for the resources to carry out those projects. So do we need a basketball court? Do we need roads? Do we need water? And this is how the communal councils began to operate after 2006 in a very radically participatory way, right? Essentially public planning through collective participation. This was, again, a formalization of the kind of barrio assemblies that had emerged spontaneously, right? The generalization of that kind of project. One of the, not shortcomings, but one of the limitations of the communal councils is that they were political institutions more than anything else, and that they had to appeal. The resources would come from the central state. And so as they cohered, and again, this came from the grassroots level, before even the government began to speak in these terms, the grassroots sectors were saying, no, we're building communes now. We're building something bigger. We are bringing and incorporating production into these communal councils. And so the formalization of this then occurs although it had been emerging, the formalization occurs around 2009 with the launch of the project of building the communal state, which brings together communal councils, in other words, political institutions, in conjunction with what are called social production enterprises, and worker-run and worker-managed factories, right? And so at this point, you have a slightly larger unit, but it has production involved, right? And so the what's called the communal parliament has representatives of all of those different entities coming together, directly democratically deciding on deciding what to produce, how to produce it, how to distribute it, sell it, who would work, how much they would get paid, any sort of surplus, what you would do with the surplus, how it would be kind of reinvested in the community. So you're moving, in other words, from the political toward also the economic, right? And when you do that, you're moving towards something sustainable. In other words, something that can fund itself, right? And there weren't many communes that reached a fully sustainable status, right? But there were some, right, that were producing huge amounts of corn, for example, and selling that, and using that to fund their own sort of local development. And it's really important to understand in the context of an oil state then that becoming sustainable means rolling back colonial legacies of unsustainability, right? The focus on oil meant that Venezuela was not producing food, right? It was importing all of its food. And so when you have communities taking the control, not only political power, but economic power into their own hands, it means they're producing the things that they need, right? That there's a sort of reassessment that's sort of happening. So this is the sort of way that the communes begin to develop after 2009. They're never big enough, right? But they became significant, and they became unified along what are called broader corridors and broader axes, where they would trade amongst each other, barter trade without sort of commercializing, without selling. They would trade coffee for chocolate, for beans for corn, and that began to develop into an alternative kind of power structure. They began to develop the federated structure of state level councils, national level councils that would all, operate in a similar way at, alongside the traditional state. The goal ultimately is for the state to disintegrate and no longer be relevant. But they never reached, of course, that point of, of power. And I want to return to the point that, that you asked in your question, which is the question of defense, right? Because again, at the same time that you have this dynamic of the spontaneous emergence of assemblies and popular power, that goes hand in hand with the spontaneous emergence of self-defense militias, right? Of communities defending themselves. And when the councils are formed and when the communes come together, they are empowered to defend their communities, right? They're empowered to set up a security patrol, to set up a way, for these, communities to, to defend themselves. And again, I'm thinking about West Philadelphia, right? I'm thinking about the fact that that is the definition of a community that does not need police, right? It's a community that organically is able to keep itself safe. And when that comes to imperialism, I think it's you're absolutely right. Because, and there was a very interesting debate now way back in like 2007, 8, around the question of the military, right? Again, there's a radical tendency within the military structure and the military hierarchy. But during this moment of debate, there were these former generals who were like, listen, like, we don't even need the military hierarchy. We don't need the generals and the lieutenants. We don't need that vertical structure. What we need is what was referred to at the time as the people in arms, right? We need to understand our self-defense against imperialism is a horizontally organized one across all of society. Now, that argument didn't fully take, right? But there were elements of that, right? There was the development, again, if you see the state, I mean, the movements organically developing upward, you see the state reaching down, you saw the development of a militia structure, a formal militia structure across the country, which is incredibly important, but was still subject to the military hierarchy. And here, in these moments of crisis, here I'm talking about the past 10 years, but also in this moment today, this becomes very important, right? Because you have a small number of individuals within a military hierarchy that can make powerful decisions about whether or not to sell out this project, whether or not to abandon it, whether or not to defect to the side of U.S. imperialism. And that pressure is only increasing. And, I want to be super clear that the Venezuelan military has not seen those defections, right? Partly because of a project of, a process of kind of cleansing, whereby over the course of many, many years, the sort of treasonous generals would pop their heads up and Chavez would get rid of them, and they would attempt something and Chavez would get rid of them. But the pressure that Venezuela has been subjected to for the last 10 years, any other country would see a coup. Any other country would see generals, standing up and trying to take power.
And they have, right?
Well, they haven't. I mean, they haven't from within, right?
No, not Venezuela. I mean, other countries.
Absolutely. And so that's all to say that, like, the military hierarchy is more dedicated to the revolution than many other places. But it's still like, it's still true that the best defense against U.S. imperialism is the grassroots, right? And so, I want to be very, very aware about the way that grassroots power is what's going to matter the most when it comes to preventing and making Venezuela ungovernable for any kind of U.S. imperial intervention or, proxy government.
You've thrown a lot of years out there, and to give us an example of how long this has been going on, can you give us an idea? Because, like I hinted earlier, a lot of the discussion, we love to hate Trump, obviously, and he's a fucking tyrant, right? There's no doubt about it. There is something wholly different about him, but this is not new in terms of U.S.-Venezuelan relations. It's not that new in terms of U.S.-South American relations or U.S. foreign policy. But it does feel a little bit different. But can you first give us maybe some Coles Notes, Venezuelan U.S. relations history to understand why Venezuela specifically, and maybe it'll give us a clue as to, why right now?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. When you go all the way back, you can just go all the way back. and actually, I've been reading for people that haven't read Greg Grandin's new book, America America. It's absolutely breathtaking sort of hemispheric history. And so please read that, because part of what Greg shows is the ways that the U.S. was worried about Venezuela. And the book's not all about Venezuela, but it has large pieces on Simon Bolivar, on the independence struggles, and the way that fed into and was opposed by U.S. settler ideology, right? The debates happening in the U.S. government were in reaction to the alternative unity that Simon Bolivar was posing, which wasn't even revolutionary. It wasn't socialism, but it was national sovereignty, right? And it was the unification of South America under the umbrella of the Gran Colombia, right? This broader sort of coalition and federation of governments. So you can go all the way back. But in recent history, it's important, as you've already suggested, to understand that this is a bipartisan aggression against Venezuela, that it, has been ongoing, but particularly under Chavismo, has seen both parties dedicated to overthrowing Venezuela. And we should think about the rhetoric that's being thrown around today. Hugo Chavez was consistently called a dictator by Democrats and Republicans, even when they knew that that was a fucking lie. Even when Chavez, in what Jimmy Carter called the cleanest elections on earth, won 66% of the vote, or 61% of like a huge landslide victory, Hillary Clinton was still going out and calling Hugo Chavez a dictator. What you saw were different strategies, right? You saw an attempted coup in 2002 under the Bush administration, not led by the Bush administration, but under the Bush administration. Then you saw Obama come into power and using softer means, funneling money through USAID into the Venezuelan opposition. The goal was to get rid of Chavez through elections. Of course, it failed because people didn't want a return to neoliberalism. They wanted Chavismo. And now you have, of course, Trump returning to this very specific and brutal form of intervention in the support of a broader project of propping up kind of faltering imperial power, right? The very open reference point for Trump is the Monroe Doctrine, which people may understand from the sort of 1820s as a framework that was again, the Monroe Doctrine emerges in opposition to simultaneously what Simon Bolivar and others are trying to build, as outside of the U.S. sort of sphere of influence. So the Monroe Doctrine is saying we're protecting Latin America from European powers. That's how the right often tries to frame it. But the reality is this is our backyard. We get to do what we want. And what that looks like is direct intervention, the emergence of U.S. imperialism as a force, beginning particularly in the 1890s, right, with the so-called Spanish-American War, the seizure of, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam. And, this opening up a period of direct military intervention, marine landings across Latin America, Central America, and, of course, the understanding that the U.S. has a direct material interest in the natural resources in Latin America, the markets, the goods, and direct trade, right? So Venezuela becomes very important. And it is important, concretely speaking, for its size, for its location, for its natural resources. And it's also important because of, more recently, the alternative that it is offering, right? All of those things matter. And there's a lot of debate today, right? It's not just about oil, but it is very much about oil, where the U.S. government does know that to prop up its power, it needs access to cheap oil. And what better cheap oil than what is located very, very close to the U.S., a strategically useful kind of oil for U.S. refineries. And again, very, very close and easy to import, does not require any passage through the Suez Canal, does not require any sort of other sort of power, especially for a Trump regime that is trying to de-emphasize wars in the Middle East and criticize those at the same time that it's sort of upholding wars in the Western Hemisphere. So oil is incredibly important. Rare earth minerals are incredibly important. Gold is incredibly important. The amount of resources in Venezuela is crucial. Again, capitalism on a sort of 500-year historical scale has to destroy community to access those resources. And not only is that always a project, but in this case, it had to destroy this project that was defending, those resources for Venezuelans. So you've got the resource question. You have the location question in terms of strategic power in the Western Hemisphere. Again, the U.S. is very concerned about China and Russia, China primarily, and having those resources, wanting those resources is one thing, having them in the hands of China is a very different thing, right? So it's competition. It's also this idea of projecting power, right? Of saying, of exaggerating your own power by acting in ways that are sort of dramatic and violent and brutal. And so it's showing, right? And this is something that Trump does systematically, which is to engage in kind of dramatic or exaggerated action or threats, whether it's tariffs or military action, and then say, okay, now everyone else has to negotiate on this new basis, right? So attack on Venezuela, negotiate with Mexico, renegotiate with Colombia, try to pressure these other countries, and to dismantle the left-wing hegemony that had existed. And here we can see the Venezuela piece as a sort of culmination in some ways of something Trump has been, and the Democrats, but fundamentally Trump has been up to for several years now, which is to pick apart and dismantle left-wing, power in the region, right? Supporting Argentina, supporting the sort of brief quasi dictatorship of Bolsonaro in Brazil, now supporting, of course, the emergence of a neo-fascist in Chile, these, coups in Bolivia and elsewhere, the right-wing turns in Central America. And again, bipartisan, it's Obama and Hillary Clinton who helped to carry out a coup in Honduras, which has led to right-wing sort of rule. And all of this is about dismantling, again, we think back to Simon Bolivar. Bolivar was not just trying to free Venezuela. He was trying to build a regional framework for what he called the Gran Colombia, the larger Great Colombia, right? Broad Colombia. In other words, a system of regional integration, which was a key project for Hugo Chavez. We can't go this alone. Therefore, we need to build alliances, whether it's the Bolivarian alternative or Mercosur or the Bank of the South or other lending institutions, to not rely on the World Bank. So, if we enter into financial crisis, to be able to call upon allies. All of that is incredibly important, that sort of safety net structure. And that's another key piece of what Trump has been dismantling and is trying to sort of, consummate today.
Speaking of those other state actors, those other players that he set his sights on, he's named some of them: Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, Greenland. And the intimidation factor, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, obviously we've experienced it here in Canada. It was a very effective tactic. Not only did it shape the negotiations between the two states and whatnot, but it allowed our government to really turn right sharply under this guise of nationalist protectionism. Do you anticipate this working that way in South America, where folks are going to have to negotiate the same kind of economic adjustments, structural adjustments that have been typically required under neoliberalism, now just with threat of military intervention instead of a big loan from the bank?
Yeah, no, it's difficult to foresee what's going to happen. First and foremost, it's important to understand that people have been shocked by the very quick turn that Trump made to working with the existing Venezuelan government, right, which is the Bolivarian government. This is the Chavista government. And so people were shocked when he very quickly dismissed Maria Corina Machado's possibility of being installed as a leader. But it shouldn't be that shocking, first and foremost, because Trump is not interested in even the thin veil of democracy, right? It's not even a primary motivator for him. Not to say that would be a democratic move at all, but the point was not, the idea that Maduro was somehow a dictator was not an important one for him, right? It's not true, but it's also not important for him. Corresponding to that is the fact that the U.S. government simply can't do the things that it's claiming that it wants to do, which is to run Venezuela, right? The opposition cannot run Venezuela. Trump cannot run Venezuela. The only people that can run Venezuela are the Chavistas, right? And the Chavista government apparatus. Secondly, what's going to play out in the trial will be very, very interesting. I'm a little shocked that he's giving Maduro and Celia Flores the opportunity to plead their case, right? And to show the fact that these charges are absolute bullshit, right? That they don't have any bearing on reality. And so that's going to be very interesting. And, it's going to be a big liability for Trump. And so the attempted projection of power and threats against the rest of the region operate in that context of, a very complicated constellation of possibility for even Trump, right? They're trying to make themselves look powerful when they actually don't have many cards in their hand. Now, the threats are coming against Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, and those are very real threats. I think we should take them seriously. I worry a lot about Colombia because Gustavo Petro it's a very right-wing country. Colombia is a sort of foundationally fascist, country that a lot of work has been put into building a progressive alternative, but it's not fully established on a solid basis. And, it's possible that Trump won't see the need to intervene because Petro is term limited. One of the struggles will be to find a candidate that can then succeed Gustavo Petro and win an election. And so I think the U.S. will actually put their resources probably into trying to win that election for the right. Cuba, of course, is a big target. Again, the U.S. cannot govern Cuba. The Cuban population is more radically organized and, ideologically sort of solid than the Venezuelan population, right? And so, but that doesn't prevent them from trying to take out political leaders or trying to leverage some kind of access to resources and markets and the island. So there are risks and there are threats. But I think the Venezuelan government now is trying to bide its time and wait out either Trump's sort of shifting sort of interest and focus, and then hopefully wait out the Trump government entirely, and see if some alternative situation can be crafted, right? And in the interim, the fundamental, call for organizers and solidarity activists, aside from the freeing of Maduro and Celia Flores, of course, and the blocking of, any further intervention through probably congressional means, the main call is to lift the sanctions, right? The sanctions have absolutely obliterated the Venezuelan economy, created an economic catastrophe, killed more than 100,000 people, clearly forced an emigration crisis that we've all seen. And almost every single piece of what the U.S. government is claiming about Venezuela, whether it's the immigration crisis or the sort of, violence or sort of so-called gangs or the question of the oil industry collapse, right? All of that is deeply rooted in this sort of brutality of these sanctions that I think people don't understand just how brutal they are and just how impossible they make it to actually sort of run an economy and, manage a country.
And that is, again, an old tactic of the United States, and then using those economic conditions for the very excuse for intervention. I want to go, you've done a great job of already kind of preemptively debunking a lot of the talking points that are circling around from the right and from within the left. Sometimes we find ourselves sitting there debating on, was Maduro a dictator? Was he not? Was he far left enough? Was he not? Do they like him there in Venezuela? Do they not? Is this, and again, a lot of it is focusing on, is this a violation of international law, right? That the media are in the faces of our global leaders, wanting to at least get them to acknowledge that it's a violation of international law. They won't even do that. Canada's Carney has completely come out in support of what's happened. We know why in Canada. We have the same hopes and dreams in terms of imperialism and settler mindset here. So that's still to play out. But I sometimes wonder, there's a lot of discussions that could be fruitful, but that seem to serve as a distraction a little bit. And I feel like the trial, if there's anything that I can make sense out of that, is that we will be so absorbed in this trial and seeing, told you so, he's not a narco-terrorist. But like, that was never the point, right? It's expanding imperialist hostilities. And when we get caught up in all of these discussions and academic discussions on international law, which, like, I don't know, after witnessing the genocide for the last 2.5 years, how anyone's still caught up and trying to have charges stick or something like that. I think that just seems like a waste of our energy. So if you could suggest a line of discussion that is just not happening, that we have maybe not even brought up here or not spent enough time on, that is far more important to discuss, especially thinking of your audience is within the imperial beast itself?
No, it's a great question. I think it's especially important for someone like Trump, right? Because we need to be very clear about the fact that Trump, with all of the shit that he's sort of engaging in, right, this strategy of flooding the zone with all of these right-wing initiatives all at once. You've got ICE in the streets, and you've got, like imperial intervention abroad, and you've got attacks on the federal, dismantling pieces of the federal government, and you've got, like all of these things are happening. The goal is not to win every battle, right? Trump knows he's not going to win every battle. And so if you fall into this sort of like language of the Democratic Party, often, which is say, well, we're going to do this in the courts and fight him, and we've won this, look at this victory. And it's like, but he's got 10 other things going on, right? That's never the strategy, right? It's a strategy of cultivated chaos and, of misdirection, right? And so you're very right that we need to avoid as much of the distraction as we can. I still wonder about the trial.
I'll still be watching.
Because it's fucking ridiculous, and it's giving Maduro and Cilia Flores a platform I did not think that he would want to give them. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out and what it introduces. But in terms of the distraction, right, I think you're absolutely right. We can have long conversations about the nature of the current leadership of the Venezuelan government. The current leadership of the Venezuelan government is not left-wing enough for me. And that's been obvious if you read anything I've written. Cool. That doesn't get us very far, right? Because the question is not, is it left enough for me? The question is, how do you build a revolutionary project and a transition towards socialism, which necessarily involves building a large tent capable of mobilizing people, educating people, building new institutions, and transforming society, right? That necessarily begins not from the left. It begins from the masses of people and what the people need. And especially in a context where the crisis is so severe, it sets a different kind of, framework for us. So yes, we could talk about the last elections in Venezuela and whether we think they stand up to sort of, that's not relevant. The reason we know it's not relevant is because we know that that's not why this happened, right? We know it's not about drugs, and we know it's not about democracy. Those are two fundamental, I almost want to say lies, but it's like Trump wasn't even putting much effort into those lies, right? That was not even, it was very clearly, and he did us the favor of making clear that it's about power and natural resources. So yes, we can skip those conversations. You and I can have those conversations some other day. This week, this conversation, this discussion we're having is about the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores in the attempt to blackmail the Venezuelan government into compliance, right? What do we do in that context? And again, the question is a question of national sovereignty, which again, I'm not a national sovereigntist. Right?
You're more of a smash the state kind of guy, but we know let's just pretend.
We get there through, and especially when we're talking about struggles in the global South, through defending, the national sovereignty of people to self-determination over their natural resources and, in politics and society, right? And that is going to be the fundamental question, right? And again, the thing, we are doing fundamentally is demanding that our government lift this brutal set of sanctions, right? There's no way to judge if you're an anarchist or a communist. There's no way to judge what's happening in Venezuela in a context of brutal sanctions. There's no way to sort of second guess this or that policy of privatization or the rollback of the social gains of the revolution without thinking primarily about the sanctions that are in place. Once we get rid of those sanctions, let's have more of a conversation about what that revolution needs to look like or should look like, or about how we can kind of interface with it. But, so we need to lift those sanctions, and we need to prevent more resources being spent. A good comrade here in Philadelphia said, recently on Facebook, he said, they just launched your school district's budget into Venezuela. Like, how does that make you feel, right? Look, we are being sort of starved of resources here because of this sort of military intervention, abroad. And that is the shit that we need to be focused on, in a fundamental, in a primary way.
I think the way that you've helped frame it today is useful. But beyond that, it allows us to be a little more hopeful, because when we look at it just from the state actor perspective, it seems very dim and grim, and we don't even understand motivations or what's going to turn out from that trial, who's going to replace him. And it seems to matter less. Not that we can just lean on the work that's already been done. There's still a role to play, but I just wanted that kidnapping line that you had, where they've used this kidnapping to intimidate and influence Venezuela. I think you've also made the argument, and I'll just repeat it, that it's used to intimidate all of us, right? Mostly Central America. They can probably see themselves in this, but Greenland is, top of the BBC headlines today, and even Canadians are talking about that possibility. So whether you think it's political suicide or the charges can't stick or what might even happen to Venezuela, that might not matter either, right? If we allow that impact of fear and intimidation to really take hold. Lots to think about, but that is so typical of our episodes, where we end up with a few more questions, but we did score some answers from you, Gio. And I very much appreciate your time. Folks will find a list of Gio's books linked in the show notes. And as soon as you look at it, you'll say, oh, I want to talk to him about this, that, and the other thing. No, honestly, Gio, like I said, I could have picked your brain. We could have talked about a lot of these aspects for ages, but I very much appreciate the time you did spend in our studio here. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for the conversation, Jessa. And, and I appreciate everyone who's listening and who is going to be in the streets pushing back on this. So thank you all.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content. And if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.